Committee will come to order. I'm pleased to be joined by all four of our sitting Federal Energy Regulatory commissioners this morning. Thank you all for being here to discuss FERC's important work. First of all, I want to congratulate Chairman Phillips for a successful and productive few months since your appointment. As I said before, there's no such thing as an acting chair, and I'm glad that you've been able to hit the ground running. I'm grateful for your efforts so far to run the Commission efficiently and to work within your jurisdiction and our laws. This morning, I look forward to discussing how FERC is addressing the critical energy challenges facing our nation. FERC is responsible for regulating natural gas markets and permitting the interstate infrastructure needed to move natural gas safely and efficiently. Of course, FERC is an independent agency, but policies and guidance of any given administration certainly can bear hearing on your work. For example, guidance on NEPA and greenhouse gas impacts issued by the White House Council on Environmental Quality can influence the FERC's procedures. Administration policies also impact permits from other agencies that are required to build infrastructure regulated by FERC. And during this administration, we've seen unprecedented delays developing needed natural gas infrastructure that would have helped restore the supply and demand balance and lower prices across the world. According to the Energy Information Administration, in 2022, we had the lowest amount of FERC-regulated natural gas pipeline infrastructure installed since EIA began tracking in 1995. Incredibly, we built less last year than during the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic or the Great Recession. The only explanation is an administration doing everything it can to block new fossil energy. And while natural gas projects were stalled in 2022, natural gas prices soared to the highest level since 2008. If we learned anything during these energy prices spikes last year, it's that Americans cannot afford for their government to blindly prioritize climate goals over the reliable and affordable energy they need to go about their daily lives. That said, I'm glad that FERC appears to have heard the concerns last year from everyday Americans and from members of Congress. We're starting to see FERC make decisions at a better pace. FERC approved more than 10 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas pipeline permits and nearly 6 billion cubic feet per day of LNG export permits over the last 12 months combined. That's more than triple what FERC approved during the 12 months prior. As you can see in 2021, the blue represents the pipeline permits, and the orange is the LNG exports. You can see how low they were. And then with the war starting and we weren't able to help our allies, you can see here that it picked up as far as the permits for pipelines. LNG was starting to come, and you can see what you all have done, which you should be commended for this. And in the past 4 months with FERC has been required to act on a bipartisan basis with only 4 members under the leadership of Chairman Phillips. The Commission has been particularly productive. As shown in the chart behind me, as I just said, FERC permitted more natural gas infrastructure in just the last 4 months than in each of the prior 2 years. Furthermore, FERC appears to be easing off the policy that most natural gas projects require a full environmental impact statement, or an EIS as we've known, instead of the more abbreviated environmental assessment, EA. This course correction has the potential to cut review times in half without cutting any of our corners. Some projects do warrant an EIS, the most comprehensive, time-intensive type of NEPA review, but there is no basis to make this the norm just because a project involves fossil fuels, as been done in the past. The federal government does an EIS for less than 1% of projects, so it was not logical for FERC to say that the majority of gas projects before it needed one. However, despite these improvements, there is still a large shadow of uncertainty over whether FERC will revert to its ill-conceived natural gas and greenhouse gas policy statements issued earlier last year. These policies signal that natural gas projects could be rejected simply because they transport a fossil fuel. Of course, we addressed those policies the last time you all were here before this committee. So I look forward to hearing about how your views may or may not have changed. Now turning to electricity. There is no doubt that our electric grid is undergoing a rapid transition, both in generation sources and in the types of demand the grid is called on to serve. The speed of this transition must be balanced against reliability and affordability of electricity. The reliability of our electric grid has been put to the test in the last few years. Frankly, I'm not sure it deserves a passing grade, and I'm especially concerned that the grid will face worse going forward. In 2021, we had a major electric grid failure during a winter storm that affected millions of people in Texas and other states. And then again, this past Christmas, during Winter Storm Elliott, nearly every part of the U.S. grid was operating under emergency conditions. More than 1.5 million people lost power. If we can't provide Americans with reliable power on Christmas, then we definitely are failing our job. I'm pleased that FERC and North American Electric Reliability Corporation have issued new cold weather reliability standards to put us on firmer footing, but we need to do more. We need to get to work to figure out what's causing these reliability breakdowns and make the corrections that are needed. FERC and NERC must move with urgency and overcome resistance to changing the status quo, whether that be from industry, other regulators, or environmental advocates. We cannot wait until 2 winters from now. This needs to be addressed for this winter. While some may find these facts inconvenient, the reality is that our dispatchable coal power was one of the most reliable energy sources during the winter storms Uri and Elliott. Coal power plants saw significant fewer outages than natural gas plants. The grid would have been absolutely decimated during these storms if our coal fleet was retired prematurely. Yet, EPA and ESG investors are on a crusade to shut down every one of these coal plants, whether the grid is ready or it is not. Whether it's EPA's effluent limitation guidelines, mercury and air toxic standards, interstate ozone transport rule, power plant CO2 regulations, or others, the potential reliability impacts of these combined regulations are simply staggering. And at the same time, EPA is working to decrease power supplied by fossil fuels. They're trying to force a dramatic surge in electricity demand with radical electric vehicle mandates on the tailpipe regulations, the expansion of renewable fuel standards to include EVs and more. FERC and NERC have not done enough to highlight and manage the reliability impacts of premature fossil retirements or significant changes to the load on the grid. We all agree that we need to address climate change, and the energy transition is happening faster than we imagined even a few years ago. But the only way to transition without sacrificing reliability and affordability is with policies that spur innovation, not elimination, so that we can use all of our energy resources in the cleanest way possible. It makes no sense at all to take tools out of the toolbox. No energy resource is immune to weather disruptions, whether that be frozen wind turbines, frozen gas wells, or frozen coal stockpiles, all of which we saw in recent winters. I also want to speak briefly about the electric transmission, which is different from natural gas because states have primary responsibility for siting of interstate projects. But similar to natural gas pipelines, high voltage transmission construction has been declining when it should have been increasing. The fact of the matter is that large, multi-state transmission lines are needed for reliability, but they are rarely getting built. And when large lines are built, it is taking a decade or longer to get through the approval process. This is simply unacceptable. Transmission is about balancing supply and demand and moving electricity from where it's most abundant to where it's most needed. To help in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we provided a long overdue fix to the backstop transmission siting authority Congress gave to FERC back in 2005 to make it actually work. But it's clear that even this current pathway still has roadblocks to constructing the high voltage, long distance lines that are needed for reliability. I'm interested to hear about FERC's activities to support transmission built out in a thoughtful way that recognizes state regulators have the primary jurisdiction over siting and paying for these projects. Lastly, let me say a few words about permitting reform. As I know, Ranking Member Barrasso released his proposal with the Ranking Member of EPW this morning. Last summer, I secured a commitment from the President and Democratic leadership that we'd get long overdue energy permitting done, finally. That led to a bill which 40 Democrats and 7 Republicans voted for in December, and which I introduced earlier this week to kickstart promoting work in the Senate again this year. And it's the only bill that had bipartisan support. I'm glad to have led the charge getting the ball rolling last year. And while we should have gotten it done then, I believe we have another chance this year. So I'm glad the ranking members have introduced, and my friend Senator Barrasso, proposal today. And I hope that we will now be able to begin a conversation that will lead to enacting bipartisan law. Permitting reform is a topic this committee knows well. As the committee with jurisdiction over energy, we are intimately familiar with the roadblocks faced by energy projects. We've covered this in many hearings over the years. That includes conversations with Secretaries Granholm and Secretary Holland over the last few weeks, and with the FERC commissioners today. Next week, we'll bring in stakeholders to provide other perspectives on needed reforms. So I'm heartened by the acknowledgement from both sides that we need to tackle permitting this year. I sincerely hope that now, with my proposal and both the House and Senate Republican proposals on the table, that we're going to be able to sit down and negotiate in good faith, putting politics aside, to craft a serious bipartisan proposal for permitting that can actually be signed into law. With that, I turn to Senator Barrasso for his opening remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding today's hearing. Chairman Phillips, members of the Commission, welcome back to the committee. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is a critically important agency. To quote Chairman Phillips from earlier this year, the services that the Commission regulates: energy, natural gas, electricity, 7% of our economy. The first 7%, because without our energy, there is so much that we cannot do. So, Chairman Phillips, I commend you for resetting the Commission's agenda. You have brought orders forward for discussions and for action. You have emphasized energy reliability and affordability. You have rightly highlighted the negative effects on families and on communities when energy prices are high. You have emphasized personal respect as a necessity, as a necessary condition for consensus on the Commission and elsewhere. Under your leadership, the Commission has made great progress since you took over just 4 months ago. Now, not always agreeing with all your decisions, the Commission still, I believe, needs to do much more to accomplish what I expect is our shared goal of affordable, reliable, and secure energy for American families and businesses. We also should strive to produce enough energy to supply friendly nations seeking to reduce their dependence on hostile actors such as Russia. Currently, we are far from achieving these goals. Last month, the Energy Information Administration issued a report stating in 2022, the least interstate natural gas pipeline capacity was added since they began data collection back in 1995. Our nation needs more and better energy infrastructure. The entities that finance, that build, that maintain, and expand energy infrastructure are their customers rely on the Commission to act promptly. The Commission must speed up its process and balance energy interests more effectively. Companies and customers expect the Commission to act only within the scope of its authority. The U.S. Supreme Court has explained clearly the principal purpose of the Federal Power Act and Natural Gas Act, and that purpose is to encourage the orderly development of plentiful supplies of electricity and natural gas at just and reasonable rates. Commissioners, Congress has charged you with this mission, and you must make it your central focus. You must resist those who want to use the Commission to circumvent Congress and fundamentally change the nation's energy sector. You must work to ensure that wholesale power markets reflect the value of reliable sources of energy. You must fight against litigation intended to block new and upgraded natural gas pipeline and electric transmission lines. You must resist efforts from other federal agencies to undermine the development of needed energy infrastructure. If you don't take these steps, energy prices will skyrocket, grid reliability will degrade, and families and businesses all across the country will suffer. We've witnessed it in New England. We witnessed it in California and elsewhere. We've also witnessed it in Europe before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when energy regulators lost sight of their principal mission. This must not be the path that we follow as a nation. Commissioners, it's beyond time to take meaningful steps to address threats to reliable, affordable, and resilient electric service. The Commission must operate in a nonpartisan manner supporting this central mission. This is especially important when it comes to the Commission's most consequential decisions. For this reason, this now draft 2022 natural gas policy statements needs to be scrapped. The Commission needs to solely pursue reasonable and balanced policies that support the development of plentiful supplies of affordable electricity and natural gas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now we're going to hear from our commissioners. We have Commissioner Willie Phillips who will start. Chairman Willie Phillips, I'm sorry.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify here today regarding the important work that we do on behalf of the American people. The Commission's jurisdiction is broad. Pursuant to the Federal Power Act, Natural Gas Act, and Interstate Commerce Act, it is our responsibility to ensure that rates for the wholesale sale and transmission of electricity, as well as transportation of oil and natural gas by pipeline, are just and reasonable. In addition, we are responsible for ensuring that the nation's bulk power system remains reliable. And last, but by no means least, we are also responsible for siting vital energy infrastructure, including interstate natural gas pipelines, facilities for exporting and importing LNG, and hydroelectric facilities. By exercising these authorities in a prudent and responsible manner, the Commission can help ensure that our country produces energy that is reliable, affordable, and sustainable. Earlier this year, President Biden designated me as chairman of the Commission, and I'm honored to appear before you today for the first time in that capacity. In January, at my first meeting, I laid out 3 principal priorities. They are reliability, electric transmission, and environmental justice. I'm happy to report to you today that in just a few short months, we have made substantial progress on all 3 fronts. I will begin with reliability because it is, and it must be, always job number 1. We face unprecedented challenges to the reliability of our nation's electric system. Foreign and domestic actors are testing our cyber defenses every day. Physical threats to the grid are on the rise, and extreme weather of all kinds is threatening the power to our customers. That is why, under my leadership, the Commission has taken at least 1 major action to promote reliability every month since I became chairman. We have required NERC to develop enhanced cybersecurity standards regarding internal network security protocols. We have approved a series of winter preparedness measures, a new reliability standard to further protect our electric system supply chain, and a system of incentives to reward certain cybersecurity investments. These actions represent the blocking and tackling that is absolutely necessary to ensure that our electric grid remains secure, reliable, and resilient. My second priority, electric transmission. It is itself a reliability imperative. Transmission plays a critical role in facilitating the interconnection of new resources while ensuring that the electric system remains reliable. And transmission is the key that can unlock the potential of so many of the energy security measures included in the Inflation Reduction Act. To those ends, we are working as quickly as possible on a number of important rulemakings, and I'll list just a few. Number 1, interconnection queue reform. 2, regional transmission planning. And 3, backstop siting authority. My third priority, environmental justice. This one is personal. I grew up in an environmental justice community in Alabama, so I have seen firsthand what it means for a community to bear more than its fair share of pollution and other costs of industrial development. But I've also seen benefits that investment can provide to historically underserved communities in the form of jobs, tax revenue, and community infrastructure. Having seen both sides, it is my goal as chairman to do all that we reasonably can to ensure that environmental justice communities do not bear too great a share of the burdens or too small a share of the benefits that new energy infrastructure can provide. Here, too, we've made strides. We announced the hiring of a new senior counsel for environmental justice and equity, and later that, in March in the same month, we held the first ever roundtable on environmental justice and equity and infrastructure permitting. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention the significant strides we have made with respect to permitting. Our country urgently needs more energy infrastructure of all kinds. As Russia's war in Ukraine has made clear, energy infrastructure is essential to any country's national security. I am proud of the steps that the Commission has taken to streamline our permitting processes so that we can more efficiently issue our decisions while at the same time continuing to enhance our reliability. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today. I look forward to answering your questions.
And now we're going to have Commissioner James Danley.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Brasso, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I want to talk about what I think is a looming reliability crisis in our electric markets, which is driven primarily by the effects of state and federal subsidies and FERC's maladministration of our markets. So the organized markets, the RTOs and ISOs, were originally conceived of decades ago as the mechanism by which we could give the benefits of competition to the ratepayers so that they get the least cost generation, and we can also use market signals to effectively incentivize the arrival of needed new generation and the retention of existing generation to meet the load requirements. This theory has not been borne out, and the reason it hasn't been in our markets is because FERC has allowed the markets to fall prey to the price distorting and warping effects of subsidies and public policies that have driven the advancement of large quantities of intermittent renewable resources onto the electric system, and have done so basically because most of the ordinary economic costs that would drive the investment of capital have failed to actually be seen in the market mechanisms. So the subsidies in question in our markets, of course I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes, every market has a different tariff and different mechanisms, but in the main, the subsidies available are so lucrative that renewables are often able to offer into the procurement auctions at zero. And just think for a moment what that means in terms of a price signal. What that means is that that generation is free. The market is saying there is no cost to this generation being built. Well, that's obviously not true. The effect of this is market-wide price suppression, and the effect of the market-wide price suppression is that it deprives the other generators that are not eligible for these subsidies of much-needed revenue, and therefore force them into premature retirement. And the problem with that is that the generators that are being retired are the ones that have the attributes necessary, like spinning mass, the inertia. They're the generators that actually have the attributes necessary to keep system stability. As an engineering matter, it is simply impossible to keep the system running entirely with unreliable intermittent generation. That is just an engineering reality. And so we are employing these market mechanisms incorrectly because we're allowing them to fall prey to the subsidies. Why is this so critical? Well, in vertically integrated states, that is the states that don't have our markets as the administrators, you have a regulatory process in which the utility and the state PUC figure out through an integrated resource plan what's needed to meet peak requirements. In our markets, there is no other authority besides the market. There's no other mechanism other than the market signals to incentivize the arrival of generation, which means that if those market signals fail, or if they are distorted, you will eventually, in the long run, have a failure to supply adequate resources to keep the system stable. Now, we have heard from our RTOs and ISOs that there is going to be capacity shortfall in the future. MISO has said it, ISO New England has said it. Even PJM, the largest of the markets, the one that serves Washington, has recently raised the hue and cry about impending resource shortfalls. We understand these are 3-year forward markets, so that means that if there's a problem 4 years from now, if it's not fixed this year, it's not going to be fixed in 4 years. These are forward contracts that we're dealing with. To show you just how broken these markets are, despite the fact that PJM is telling us we're having impending shortfalls of capacity, at the last residual auction, the prices actually went down. And you don't need to be a PhD in economics or have some strange theory to let you know that scarcity pricing is not supposed to reflect lower prices when scarcity is imminent, right? That just is not how it works. FERC has, I'm sorry to say, been the midwife to some of the problems that have led to these market signals being warped. We got rid of the minimum offer price rule in some of our markets. That was a mechanism that was employed by FERC to ensure that resources had to bid in their actual costs, right, as opposed to bidding in what they are able to based upon subsidies. We even have increased the moral hazard of the entire procurement auction mechanism by an order recently issued that over my strenuous objections, that sought to reset the market prices after the auction ran in order to lower the prices that resulted. Well, the reason why the prices go up is because there's scarcity of some kind, and as the old economic saw goes, the solution to high prices is high prices. if we don't allow the pricing mechanisms to work and we don't allow the incentives to actually, that is, the market incentives to drive people's action, it's impossible to rationally allocate capital, and we will find that there are reliability failures. And I hope that I'm proven wrong on this, right? None of us want to have a reliability disaster, but given the fact that we have put so much trust in these markets and we're giving them the basic job of trying to procure resources, I think it's very likely inevitable. So my time is up. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now we have Allison Clements, our other commissioner.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee. I appreciate the honor to testify here this morning. I'm honored to continue to serve at this critical time for our energy system. I also appreciate the chance to continue the dialogue with this committee about the inflection point that the energy transition has created for that system. Our nation's grid continues to face significant challenges, including outdated infrastructure, a changing resource mix, and intensifying extreme weather events. FERC is tasked with striving for system affordability and reliability in the face of these challenges, while appreciating some sober realities: Russia's war in Ukraine, inflation, and the evolving cyber and physical threat to the grid. This morning, I will highlight a few of my own priorities related to our affordability and reliability mandates. I'll start with our outstanding proposals on transmission planning and interconnection reform. EEI has estimated that U.S. utilities invested almost $28 billion in electric transmission last year. Customer dollars are going to be spent on transmission in any case. I believe it is FERC's job to direct that investment in a manner that provides the most benefits to customers at the lowest cost. Our regional planning proposal gives states an important seat at the table and requires long-term planning across a variety of potential scenarios in the face of uncertainty. Our generator interconnection proposal addresses another aspect of the problem: overwhelmed and broken interconnection processes around the country, where projects face years-long delays in line in hopes of connecting to the grid. While facilitating efficient transmission, planning, and interconnection reform are cornerstones of ensuring future reliability, it has not been the Commission's only reliability focus. Since Winter Storm Uri in February 2021, FERC has made progress on several recommendations proposed by the North American Reliability Corporation and FERC staff, including the issuance of new cold weather reliability standards. I am also pleased that FERC will host its second New England Gas Electric Winter Reliability Forum in June to address the region's specific challenges. I have and will continue to push the grid operator, states, and stakeholders in New England to quantify their short and longer-term risk using a data-driven, technology-neutral approach. Of course, no matter the region and no matter the season, no solution for today's reliability challenges will be complete without consideration of all the tools in the reliability toolbox. We can improve the efficiency of the existing grid at relatively low cost using grid-enhancing technologies, and I hope FERC will finalize several rules that involve the use of those technologies. We can leverage the amount of distributed energy resources and demand response through effective implementation of market rule changes and through continued partnership with state regulators. These initiatives, together with ongoing interregional transmission planning and cost management discussions, are meant to maintain reasonable costs for customers while reducing the likelihood that any single severe storm or other event will cause shocks to customer bills or power outages. We have an urgent need to move forward in finalizing them. I will end with two bright spots. Last month, under Chairman Phillips' leadership, FERC held an Environmental Justice and Equity Roundtable at the Commission. The event reminded me of the importance of engaging early and effectively with frontline and fence-line communities, not only to address their important concerns, but to ensure the legal durability of our decisions. Finally, I want to share a note of praise for FERC's Office of Public Participation. I am pleased with what OPP has accomplished during their short tenure so far, and I look forward to their continued growth. As always, it is my honor and privilege to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now we have Commissioner Mark Christie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee. It's an honor again to appear in front of you. And I want to start off and just give some kudos to our chairman, Chairman Phillips. I think he's done a great job in a very challenging situation, and enjoy having him as our chairman. The one issue I want to just focus on today, I think, is reliability. And I'm really afraid to say that I think the United States is heading for a very catastrophic situation in terms of reliability. Hope it doesn't happen, but I think we're heading for potentially catastrophic consequences. And the core of the problem is actually very simple. We are retiring dispatchable generating resources at a pace and in an amount that is far too fast and far too great, and it is threatening our ability to keep the lights on. Now, the problem is not the addition of wind and solar and other renewable resources. The problem is the subtraction of dispatchable resources such as coal and gas. And of course, Mr. Chairman, as you know, when a dispatchable coal unit is prematurely retired in West Virginia, it's still in rate base, and consumers still have to pay for it if it's prematurely retired. But this is going on all over the country in both RTO and non-RTO states. This almost cascading number of early retirements. And when I mean early retirements, I mean retirements when there's still many years of useful life left on these generating units. So let's look at PJM for one example, and the chairman alluded to PJM. The CEO of PJM, and PJM, by the way, is the biggest RTO in terms of load, in terms of consumers served in our country. So the CEO of PJM announced just a few weeks ago that PJM is projecting that they're going to lose 40 gigawatts of generating resources, 90% of which is dispatchable, coal and gas primarily. And they're going to lose these 40 gigawatts of dispatchable resources in just the next few years. At the same time, and by the way, the independent market monitor for PJM says the actual number is not 40 gigawatts, it's over 50 gigawatts of prematurely retiring generating resources. And against this, PJM is projecting at least 13 gigawatts of load growth. And so even if you took every unit in the queue, and people who think, well, if we just clear the queue, everything will be fine. No, it won't. You could clear the whole queue, and you wouldn't be close to covering what PJM is projecting in terms of their lost resources. And as we all know, and this is a hard fact, as the chairman alluded to it, the fact is most of the units that are in the PJM queue, almost 90% plus, are either wind or solar. So you can clear that queue, but a nameplate megawatt of wind or solar is simply not equal in terms of capacity value to a nameplate megawatt of coal or gas or nuclear. It's just not there. So basically in PJM, the arithmetic doesn't work. The arithmetic doesn't work, and we're going to end up with more situations like we had last Christmas during Winter Storm Elliott, when PJM came that close to having rotating outages. Now, the largest part of the problem in PJM, again, was the gas units. A lot of the independent gas units didn't show up. So let's talk about the two reasons why these cascading retirements and why we're heading for what I think is a potentially catastrophic situation. First, yes, market design is a problem. In the RTOs, particularly those with capacity markets like the eastern RTOs, market design is a big reason that we're seeing a lack of resources showing up and resources prematurely retiring. You know, these markets, and they're called markets, they're not markets. They're administrative constructs. They always have been. They're called markets. They have some market characteristics, but they're not true markets. And particularly the capacity markets, which in the eastern RTOs like PJM are the main way to get to resource adequacy, are increasingly just simply not working. So market design in the RTOs is a big problem, but I don't want to rule out the non-RTOs either. There's problems with premature retirements there too. The second reason particularly is we are not building a transportation capacity for gas units. Gas units increasingly are the ones that we're being called upon to be the balancing resources when coal retires prematurely. But if you can't get gas to the generating units, they can't run. And one of the big problems that we already know and from Elliott and PJM was a lot of the independent gas generators that didn't have firm supply didn't have any gas supply during the storm. So this problem is coming. It's coming quickly. The red lights are flashing. And I think as a member of FERC, it's important for us to tell you that we see these problems coming. They're real. And if we don't do something about them, I'm afraid that we're going to look at potentially catastrophic situations. And what we saw in Winter Storm Uri in Texas, I think, is a harbinger of what we're going to, because that was a supply problem, a supply default. And Winter Storm Elliott was the same way. Supply didn't show up when it needed to show up, and I think we're heading to more situations like that. And with that, I'll be happy to answer your questions, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank all of you for your opening remarks, and we appreciate it. Now we'll start with our questions, and I'll begin. First of all, you know, we see we have a 2-2 split, and people say that we're just divided and we can't get anything accomplished. It looks like you all done fairly well getting things accomplished in this 2-2 split. Do you subscribe to that or agree that FERC is not able to continue to come together or basically work well in the 2-2 split, or do you see basically the need? I mean, there'll definitely be a fifth member, but I'm just saying that you have to do your job until that happens. So each one of you can comment on that. We'll start with Chairman Phillips.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin. Thank you for the question. I can say this. This commission, even though we're divided, and there was lots of doom and gloom about our inability to get things done, we have not sat on our hands. We have kept pace with past commissions as we have moved forward important, critical infrastructure projects that's needed for the reliability of our grid. And I can tell you this, it has very little to do with me, sir. I give the credit, all of the credit, to my colleagues. They have stepped forward to lead, to make sure that we don't have a situation where we can't move things forward. I can't do it by myself. I give them all of the credit.
Thank you.
I think that there have been, excuse me, Senator.
Go ahead.
I think so far there have been no, no problems at all with the 2-2 split. The rate of orders has been moving apace, and we've had, I'd say, very good collegiality talking about the contents of the orders over the last few months.
Well, you all bring a diverse amount of talent to and that's what's great to see all this talent coming together for purpose and a cause. Chairman, Commissioner Clements.
I think we're doing fine. I think Chairman Phillips is doing a great job. I think we're very busy, and there are some really important proposals out there that we need to act on.
Chairman Christie.
Yeah, I don't really look at it as a 2-2 split. I look at 4 members. Now, we're all 4 lawyers, so that means we have 16 different opinions on any issue. But you know, we only need 3 votes to get something out, and the business is getting done. And actually, you know, the vast majority of our cases come under the Federal Power Act, and I think there's no real particular lineup on how people vote on the Federal Power Act issues, particularly the ones that come up from the RTOs. So I don't think it's a 2-2. I think it's a matter of getting to 3 votes on every order, and I think that the track record shows that, in fact, we're doing that in most every case.
And you had a lot of unanimous, too, which really speaks volumes for all of you.
The vast majority are unanimous, actually.
Let me throw this to you. What I didn't understand, the PJM system, which I know I've been in the PJM, I was born and raised in the PJM system, know it well. I've been through some of the challenges, and I'm concerned. But you all said something. The subsidies, every power source is subsidized. Coal subsidized to a certain extent. You can say, well, they get this and that in credit and offsets. Nukes subsidized, and wind and solar. But wind and solar is coming on, and when it comes on, basically, it has to go when it comes on. So if you're going to dispatch and basically shut something down in order to make capacity for the new technology that, of wind and solar, but does not have the storage to give it to you when it needs it, you got to give it to you when it makes it. Is that the problem? And you said the cost is coming on at 0. I know that it's come from like 16 cents a kilowatt hour down to 5 and 6 cents. Coal's gone up because of environmental concerns. I understand that, and all the rest of them. I just keep saying that I know back home, they want to keep the lights on. They want to be able to take care of their families and their businesses. And I looked over at what happened in Europe. And yesterday I had the privilege of talking to German military that were here giving me assessments on different things. But we start talking about energy. Tell me what happened. He said, we made a grave mistake. We took off our dispatchable quicker and got hooked on cheap Russian oil and gas. He said we got hooked on cheap Russian oil and gas. And then we thought the North Sea could produce all of our wind that we needed. None of that happened, and they got in a situation. They threw caution to the wind as far as oversight on environmental oversights to keep people from freezing and starving. So we know the geopolitical risk that we're taking here, but is it because are we looking at all the cost when you do that, taking the subsidies away from the actual cost, or basically looking at the cost delivered? How, I mean, I know Commissioner Danley, you said that. And
when I was speaking about the offering in at 0, I was specifically talking about the capacity market. I'm not talking about the all-in cost to consumers. That's a matter of both the real-time energy costs they have to
But
bear.
how it comes onto the grid? How's it, you only have so much capacity in the grid. It's like a highway. You got 3 highways, three lanes, and you got 4 lanes of traffic, you got a problem.
So you rightly identify the fact that electricity is unique as a commodity because it has to be produced as it's being consumed, other than marginal, really unimportant to the running of the system storage capacity. And the more of the dispatchable resources that are displaced because they become uneconomically viable, the harder it is to rely upon intermittence to keep the system running. It's just a matter as
Dispatchable, as you talked about, so for everybody, it's 24/7.
Yeah,
It's your base load.
Or not, it's not only base load. This would also include things like gas plants, which can be, in the moment of shortfall, right? As soon as load
Right.
comes on, then you have to immediately meet the load with new generation. And if there's a drop-off, then you have to immediately make up the shortfall. And so natural gas has been, we have moved to over the last 20 years.
But you're
to make
saying
up a
that
lot of
basically that those that are non-dispatchable, that aren't 24/7 base load, they're basically, because of pricing, pushing off in early retirements, as I think
Yes.
that Chairman Christie said, and we see that happening.
Yes.
And pushing off quicker than we have the ability to replace, so we're going to be in a very unreliable situation, is what you're saying.
That's right.
Your turn.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me stick with you, Commissioner Danley. I mean, we've just heard about the potential for catastrophic problems with the grid. You mentioned it, as did Commissioner Christie. In your opening statement, you said, as an engineering matter, there is no substitute for reliable dispatchable generation. You said intermittent renewable resources like wind and solar are simply incapable by themselves of ensuring the stability of the bulk electric system. Commissioner Christie said the red lights are flashing, problems are coming. The problem generally is not the addition of intermittent resources, primarily wind and solar, but the far too rapid subtraction of dispatchable resources, especially coal and gas. So please briefly explain why natural gas, nuclear, coal, and hydropower plants are absolutely necessary to keep the grid stable.
So, Senator, when you are trying to run an electric system stably, there are certain attributes, and I'm not going to get into VARs and all the complexities of the engineering to keep it brief, but there are basic attributes that large generators that have large spinning mass have. When you, as I just alluded, you have to produce the electricity at the same time it's consumed. When the load changes, the frequency and the voltage change, and the large spinning mass of bigger generators, not intermittents, allow the system to ride through more stably than if you were relying wholly on inverter-based resources like wind and solar. So it's the basic inherent attributes of those assets.
So, Commissioner Christie, President Biden's determined to electrify everything, in my opinion, no matter what the cost, no matter what the consequences are on the American people. What do you think the cost and consequences are going to be of forced electrification on President Biden's timeline?
Well, I don't know about the timeline, but whenever as you increase electrification, let's say of the transportation sector, the home heating sector, the other uses where right now maybe natural gas is being used, obviously you increase load, you increase demand, and just under supply and demand, as you increase demand, you've got to keep pace on supply. And this is where I think we're looking at potentially catastrophic consequences, because if the demand curve is just going up exponentially, which it would do if with electrifying the transportation sectors really quickly, but at the same time, the supply curve is going down with the dispatchable resources that you need to meet the demand. Again, the arithmetic doesn't work. And that's what the PJM situation is really showing, is that when you look at all the gigawatts of resources, dispatchable resources that are going to be prematurely retiring, at the same time load is going up, the numbers just don't balance.
So, Commissioner Danley, the Energy Information Administration recently released their figures showing, and I quote, the least U.S. interstate natural gas pipeline capacity on record was added in 2022. So in your view, how did the Commission's decisions in 2021, 2022 contribute to this failure?
Well, so the Commission bears virtually all the responsibility for this. We are absolutely the ones who caused this. I hate to say I told you so, but a year ago we had a hearing on some of the decisions that FERC had made and the promulgations of the Commission. And at the time I said that the slow processing of the Section 7 applications, that is for interstate natural gas pipelines, and the regulatory uncertainty that was going to be created by standardless standardless issuances in which the pipeline applicants had to guess what kind of mitigation would be good enough to pass muster under a sort of black box review by the commission. I said that was going to have a chilling effect on investment, that it was going to be impossible to rationally allocate capital, and we have seen the results of those policies. And we still have a cloud even now, because I've repeatedly called on the commission, my colleagues, to close those dockets. I really think that as long as those things remain open, we're going to have a continued regulatory uncertainty that's going to chill investment.
Well, Commissioner Clements, what do you think about that?
I think the commission has taken a case-by-case approach to both Section 7 pipelines and Section 3 LNG facility applications. And in each case, there is a decision made, there has to be a decision made to balance between speed and checking all and doing the sufficient analysis so that if a case goes to court, it withstands review. And that's the approach that I've brought to all of these dockets.
A final question for the chairman. Chairman Phillips, today wind and solar developers are accounting for the vast majority of the applications to connect new electric generation facilities into the grid. Grid operators can't depend on wind turbines, solar panels to supply power whenever the demand is there. In contrast, natural gas generators can quickly supply or reduce power to the grid. To me, that means natural gas generators help balance, though, the weather-dependent resources like wind and solar. Natural gas provides the backup support that wind and solar need. So is it fair to say that delaying necessary natural gas pipelines and infrastructure undermines efforts to allow the additional wind and solar facilities to be connected to the grid?
Yes, Senator, I believe that's absolutely true. My colleagues have talked about it already a little bit. Actually, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, they've warned us that we're already seeing potential impacts to reliability on the grid. I think it's also important that as chairman, we're clear that we are resource neutral. We want to advance and open the markets to all resources. And so transmission reform is another important factor when it comes to the question.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Barrasso for this important hearing. FERC plays a critical role in ensuring all Americans pay just and reasonable rates for their their energy supplies, and this role becomes even more important, in my opinion, during a time of transmission. No more than today, as hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested to diversify and decarbonize the energy mix, digitize the grid, and accommodate more intermittent supply and energy options. And with climate change driving more frequent and severe weather events like hurricanes, wildfires, ice storms, flooding, it's abundantly clear that we need to move to an improved, reliable, and resilient electric grid. Many of my colleagues here represented 1.5 million customers who lost power last December to the winter storm Elliott. And in fact, over 80% of the major outages over the past two decades were attributed to weather events. Notably, of the extreme weather-caused outages shot up roughly 78% over the last decade. So my point in making that is that I want a full and functioning FERC. I want you to pay attention to this as we go into the diversification that I think we need to do, because our grid is at peril. We have lots of policy ideas and certainly support the chairman's efforts in the past on middle mile and fiber, and think that his state has led on some of those issues. But I wanted to see, in the wake of the Enron crisis, we had to make sure that actually then Chairman Wellinghoff from Nevada did a really great job in implementing the authority we gave to FERC to really be a policeman on the beat. Since that date, there have been over 130 settlement agreements and assessments, over $800 million in civil penalties and disgorgement of another $500 million in illegal profits. So I just want to make sure that I joined my colleague again from Nevada on making sure that we have tough enforcement here on traders who continually manipulate the market. This is crazy that they go from one company to the next and just set up the same schemes. So I'd like to hear from commissioners whether you believe that energy markets have to be free of manipulation. This confusion, well, can you have just and reasonable rates and manipulation? I'll be clear. The answer, in my opinion, is no. You can't have manipulation if you're going to have just and reasonable rates. And should those gains, misgotten gains, be promptly returned to the injured parties and to consumers? So if I could hear views on that quickly. And yes, and whatever your answers are, quickly. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, they should be return to the consumer, and I think also FERC would benefit from the authority. I think I read where you had a bill to give FERC the authority to de-license or revoke the ability of traders who manipulate the market to continue doing that. I don't think we have that authority now, and I think it'd be a good authority to have.
Thank you. That is Senator
I'm sorry, Senator Kim.
I've joined her on that bill. It's
All
very
right.
important, and, but I'm bringing it up. Yes.
I agree completely with Commissioner Christie.
I just delivered a homily on market signals, so of course I think markets should be free of manipulation. And yes, we should return ill-gotten gains if they're found to be to the ratepayers.
Thank you.
You're seeing yet again another unanimous decision right here in front of you.
Okay.
I agree.
Well, I think this is, as we face tight markets and chances, look, it's always surprising. These aren't, well, the traders who manipulate these schemes, as we have seen, actually at the over at CFTC too, but, you know, FERC, again, when you play this role of just and reasonable rates, having an anti-manipulation authority that the commission aggressively enforces, I think is very critical. And so I'm glad to hear you endorse the Cortez Masto Cantwell bill on this as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for your service and for being here today. Commissioner Christie, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right. I want to talk about permitting reform. This is a topic that's finally become sexy, popular to people on both sides of the aisle, and not a moment too soon. It's gaining some traction, and with good reason. It is encouraging that there is a growing consensus that we need to update our regulations so that we can produce more energy in America and rely less on other countries that have lower environmental standards than we do, and also be in a position to supply more natural gas to other countries that rely on much dirtier forms of electric power generation. But unfortunately, some harmful ideas have made their way into the mix. And some of those ideas would increase consumer costs without providing any benefits. Now, one of those ideas involves spreading the cost of large transmission lines among and between a larger group of electricity ratepayers, of customers. This idea, according to those proposing it, is necessary because it would make it easier for them to build large, long-distance lines to deliver wind and solar power to places like California that suffer frequent power shortages directly attributable to their short-sighted, aggressive, radical climate change policies. Now, in my opinion, it's simply not fair to force ratepayers in states like Utah or Idaho or Wyoming to pay for and otherwise shoulder the burden associated with the costs of the California and the Oregon climate policies. So, Commissioner, should Congress be in the position of socializing the costs of large transmission lines to customers who will never benefit from those lines?
Well, to focus on the transmission instead of the permitting, first of all, I think they're separate issues. I think permitting is a legal authority to move forward with construction, and we have huge problems with court reviews on that, as we all know. On transmission, I think that a transmission line that would not be built but for the public policies of a state or state, the cost should be allocated to the state or state that wants to move forward with the public policy projects. There are really three buckets of projects of transmission. The first are reliability projects, and I think everybody agrees reliability projects need to be built, absolutely. Economic projects are where you solve more congestion costs with a transmission line, and everybody generally agrees you need to build those. The public policy-driven projects are projects that are built, but would not be built but for, and they're primarily state policies. And so if the state policies are driving the projects, and classic example is New Jersey's offshore wind, which is driven purely by New Jersey's policies, then I think most people would say that you shouldn't allocate the cost of New Jersey's policy-driven projects to, for example, in PJM, to consumers in West Virginia. And that's the fundamental principle of let the states that want the policy-driven projects allocate the costs among themselves.
Thank you. That's helpful. Commissioner Danley, let's turn to you. As you're well aware, FERC has a pretty well-defined mission, and it's a mission that the Supreme Court described back in 1976 as involving a job to, quote, encourage the orderly development of plentiful supplies of electricity and natural gas at just and reasonable rates. I've noticed that in recent years, in the last 2.5 years in particular, we've seen the Commission starting to stray from that mission. And while I'm pleased that there's been some progress over the last few months toward reversing that disturbing trend, I remain very concerned about the lingering uncertainty that's there, uncertainty that's been contributed to by past FERC decisions, especially those in the last 2 years, that have a tendency to stifle investment in natural gas pipelines and electricity transmission projects. What should FERC be doing, in your view, to provide more certainty to project investors making risk assessments?
Senator, you are quite correct to be concerned about the regulatory uncertainty. FERC is, at its core, a rate-making agency, and what we should do is make our rate decisions as clear as possible. When tariffs are approved, we need to enforce the terms of the tariff. One of the worst things that the Commission does is constantly grant illegal retroactive waivers to do things like jump queue positions or have deadlines that are relied upon to manage queue processing. We need to have clear and firm rules, and we need to apply them, and we need to set the circumstances of clarity and regulatory certainty that allows a rational allocation of capital. Because the risk premiums now, given the uncertainty regulatorily, are so great that they're stultifying investment in critical infrastructure.
I've got additional questions. We've got a lot of members here, and so I'm not going to take more time. As my time has expired, I'll submit those for the record. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heinrich.
Chairman, I want to start just by saying, as an engineering matter, that we are no longer dependent on spinning mass to regulate frequency or voltage. You can accomplish that with state-of-the-art inverters. That's actually articulated in IEEE 1541, and we've been doing it in Hawaii for years. I want to get to the issue of federal rights of first refusal. So commissioners, I'm highly concerned that the FERC's proposed plan to reinstate additional federal rights of first refusals for regionally planned transmission facilities is fundamentally anti-competitive and will hinder new transmission lines from being built. I don't ask that you take my word for that. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission had equally strenuous opinions to say about this. So I just wanted to ask you, Chairman Phillips, is the Commission still considering reinstatement of federal rights of first refusals?
Thank you, Senator. That is one aspect that's in our proposed rule on transmission, regional transmission planning. We propose that we reinstate the ROFR in very limited circumstances. For example, where there's joint ownership. But to be clear, we've had many comments on the record. We're reviewing those comments, and I'm open to changes to the proposed rule.
I would just urge you to look very closely at that policy, because I think we obviously have a transmission issue. You've articulated that well, and we do not want to create a situation where we're making that even harder to fix. The transmission and cost allocation NOPR does not propose changes to the existing interregional transmission coordination and the cost allocation requirements in Order 1000. I think that interregional progress is really key to solving these transmission issues. So 2 questions. Chairman, does the Commission intend to undertake such action on interregional planning and cost allocation?
Yes, absolutely. I've talked about interregional transmission capabilities since I joined the Commission. You don't have to look any further than recent extreme weather events to see how critical and important it can be to maintaining the reliability of the grid. It is my hope that in the very near term, we can take up a proposal on interregional. You mentioned cost. I don't want to take away from your time. I have a lot to say on that issue. Well, we had a forum last fall on cost containment. And to be clear, this is something that I believe is critically important. When you talk about affordability, it's something that we're still struggling with the last recession that we had, the last economic crisis. People are hurting still. So when there's just a slight uptick in cost on energy bills, people feel it. People like where I'm from. And so I take this very serious. It's top of mind for me.
Yeah, I think one of the big issues is cost allocation, right? How do you do that fairly? And a key obstacle to planning some of those interregional transmission lines is that individual states and RTOs are using different planning models. So you get in sort of a food fight when it comes to cost allocation. So on that point, is FERC considering standardizing planning and planning methodologies for transmission so that we can sort of negotiate some of those food fights and agree to one set of rules of the road?
Cost allocation is certainly on the table. It's a big part of why we're doing our regional planning. We have a proposal that would bring states more into that process. I think there are many different ways you can do it. You know, there's the, you can do it as a ex ante approach. You can have a state agreement approach, which is something that we've approved in the past. I know my colleagues feel very strongly about this. We've received comments. These are all important reforms that we're considering.
I've got about 50 seconds left, so I'm going to throw you a more open-ended question, which is just the role of reconductoring in transmission. Obviously, you know, when you reconductor, you can dramatically increase throughput. You can, you know, line losses are reduced. You can improve the economics, and if you can pass those along to customers, then you can really help them with their economic challenges. And grid-enhancing technologies, also things like power flow controls, dynamic line rating, have huge potential to help relieve some of this transmission congestion while you do the hard work of getting transmission built in across the country. So just talk about those things, how FERC is thinking about them as you look at the overall needs to increase transmission planning.
Senator, you are preaching to the choir when you talk about grid-enhancing technologies. Advanced reconductoring, I think that these types of tools, they have to be a part of our planning process. It addresses every single point that I raised: reliability, affordability, and sustainability. Dynamic line ratings.
And not at cross purposes. It actually aligns those things.
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, and when you talk about dynamic line ratings, we have a proposal, we have a proceeding that's ongoing on that. Ambient adjusted line ratings. We've accepted 6 compliance filings already where our regions are implementing, our utilities are implementing ambient. So this is something that I take very serious. It is top of mind for me.
Thank you all. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And speaking about transmission, I will say this just for the record, that was our greatest challenge we had in negotiating our permitting bill. It really was. It's something that we have to overcome, but it was taken to note that if a state such as mine, who's a net exporter of power, and a power line has to come through to service the East Coast, West Coast, whatever, in the PJM system, they should not be any cost allocations to a state that's a net exporter. We thought we worked through all that, but that is one of the greatest challenges. You are going to be very much involved in this whole process as we go through this permitting. The House gave us a piece of legislation with no transmission in it. Any bill's not going to happen without transmission. Same as pipelines, everything. It's all needed. So we know how critical this is, and we really appreciate y'all's input, and we're looking forward to your expertise on this. With that, we have Senator Cassidy.
Hey, folks. I always think about this testimony throughout the year, and so it's always very thought-provoking. Thank you. Partly because you provoke each other. That's also a little bit amusing. Chairman Phillips, I'm told that the queue for an LNG export plant, that if somebody files, the queue is based upon the timestamp of the filing, even if none of their financing is put together. And that there are other projects which the financing is fully mature and it could launch, but it's stuck behind. Seems less than optimal to me. 1, is it true? And if 2, is it optimal? Or 3, if not optimal, what should we do?
I think the best thing that we can do.
Or is it true?
I will have to look into that. I'm not sure exactly about, you know, what you raised with the timestamp and when the clock starts. Can I just say this real quick? The best thing that we can do is to make sure that we faithfully execute our statutory obligations. And to be clear, since I've taken over as chairman, we've done everything we can to streamline our internal review processes. We've approved, when you talk about BCF, as much this year as we have equal to the last 2 years combined.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Christie, okay, bunch of solar people in my office yesterday, and they're telling me how in New Orleans, which suffered after the storm with great power outage, that you could set up solar panels, rooftop solar with a big battery there, and that would store the energy, so if the power lines go down, it could feed back in. That almost seems like that would be, I could ask several of you this question, but it almost seems like that could be the sort of a base load that would be available should the other renewables at any given time not successfully put forward adequate power. Now, all I know is what I'm told. So I'm kind of sending it to you because I always like your comments. Is that pie in the sky, or could that be feasible for a city of roughly 350,000 people?
Well, it'd work for about 4 hours because that's about the length of a battery. We don't have long-duration storage on an industrial scale that could run for a week and inject thousands of megawatts.
Now, if we're talking about just peaking, for example, in the afternoon, we all know we're going to need more because in Louisiana, you run the air conditioner in the afternoon, or at least you run it more. You know what I'm saying? Could that serve as the peaking, if not the kind of wholesale? Because when a hurricane hits, as we all know, there's a lot of problems.
No, it absolutely is a peaking resource, and particularly like on a late summer afternoon in Louisiana when it's really hot and it's sunny, the solar is generating and at 100% capacity, and it's wonderful. What you really need to keep the grid going, though, you have to have a balanced portfolio, and you have to have enough different resources that can run at every second of every hour of every day, because the grid has to be balanced every second of every hour of every day. So while you have some resources that are great for peaking, but you need other resources that can run on a continuous basis for literally.
Oh, I accept that. I'm not arguing that.
Right.
Mr. Danley, there was something in your testimony that seemed quite pregnant with meaning, but I did not quite understand. Okay? On the bottom of page 1, going into page 2, FERC has directly interfered with price formation by allowing one of our wholesale markets to change the rules of its procurement auction after the auction had run in order to lower the resulting price. Can you elaborate on that and give specific detail?
So yes, Senator, I'm sorry that wasn't clear enough. We had a recent order that was issued, and we have to be a little bit careful because this is still pending before the commission, but I can always talk about what the order said. It allowed for for PJM to reset the auction results because there was an idiosyncratically high price that came out of one of the areas within the market. And it is my contention in my testimony that if we are going to rely upon procurement auctions, that is capacity auctions, to ensure resource adequacy, then we cannot rerun auctions, because the moral hazard that attends changing the rules after the fact means that nobody in future auctions will believe that the offers they make into it will actually be honored, and they will be unable to price the risk that's necessary in formulating the correct offers. It will fundamentally undermine the mechanisms that we are relying upon.
So, Mr. Phillips, how would you respond to that? Because it's frankly, seems pretty convincing to me.
My colleague talked about an idiocentric anomaly. Now, I call that an error. There was an error in the auction.
But these are major players, right? This is not like Bill Cassidy goes to the mall one day and pays 3 times as much as he should for an iPad or whatever.
This was way more significant than that. We're talking.
But I mean, these are mature, sophisticated bidders. So I'm a little skeptical that they would make a mistake. I just say that.
The PJM, the grid operator, the independent market monitor, the states, they all agreed that this was an error to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, impacting one of the poorest areas in all of.
So can I ask Mr. Danley, how would you respond to that? And then I'm out of time, if I can just ask.
It is not an error to have high prices at times of scarcity. That is not a bug of a market. That is what markets are for. And if what we keep doing is ex post facto remedies to, it's not an error, it is a scarcity signal. If we make ex post facto corrections to fix non-errors, that is to say actual signs of scarcity, the markets will fail.
I'm out of time unless the chairman indulges and wishes to pursue himself, but thank you all very much.
We'll get right back to it. Hold on, let me see who we have here. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. I am going to defer to my colleague to the left, Senator King, who has an appointment he has to get to.
Next to you, rather than implying an ideological. I do think it's charming that my friend from Louisiana remembers iPods. That was nice that you did that. Mr. Chairman, when we're talking about rebuilding the grid, I hope that the FERC will encourage reconductoring and technological smart grid enhancements before having to go to new rights-of-way, and I know that's going to be necessary, but it seems to me that the structure should be, let's start with the cheaper stuff first before we go to the total expansion. Is that a sensible way to proceed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, sir. I believe that grid-enhancing technologies like advanced reconductoring, dynamic line ratings, ambient-adjusted line rating, these are things that are essential to planning for our future.
Is there a way that you can enforce that? In other words, can you, if an applicant comes forward with a proposal for a new right-of-way, you can say, no, wait a minute, have you done these other less expensive and less intrusive steps first?
We're considering proposals just like the one you mentioned, Senator, in our regional transmission planning proceeding. I absolutely agree this is something that we should discuss, and I'm open to it.
I want to move to a question that really isn't strictly a FERC question, but is certainly involved in this area, and that is the interconnection queue at the RTOs. I may be the only senator ever stuck in an RTO queue for a generating plant, although at the time it was a matter of months. Now we're talking about years. In fact, I think last year the estimate was 5 years. We're all talking about, Mr. Chairman, we're talking about permitting reform and speeding things up. This is a serious bottleneck. How do we address it? To any of you, but I'll start with you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. There's several different proposals that we have in our interconnection queue reform, NOPR. What we have now is a system where it's a serial approach, where you get first come, first serve. What we've proposed is that we move to a clustered approach, where it's first ready, first served. This has been used in other parts of the country. I think there's a real potential that this can help unlock some of the bottleneck that we've seen.
Do you have authority to impose this kind of system, or is this just mother may I to the RTOs?
For the RTOs and the regulated utilities, we have authority, yes, sir.
I hope that that's something that will be acknowledged and taken seriously, because, again, we can work very hard here on permitting reform to shorten the term, but if you then have to tack on 5 years at the end because of this interconnection issue, that defeats the whole purpose. We're in a race against time here, and that's incredibly important. Another question, and any of you, please jump in if you have further thoughts. Are you satisfied with the cyber standards of the utilities? Are you satisfied that they're taking the requisite actions in order to protect? Because clearly, in a conflict, I think GPS will be the first to go, and probably the electric system will be the second level of target. Are you satisfied of where the industry is?
I give our grade on cybersecurity right now an incomplete. I think we still have work to do. Our cybersecurity standards, they are a floor. They provide, I believe, some of the most best practices. You know, we have a two-pronged approach, just to be clear, when it comes to cybersecurity. We have mandatory reliability standards, and we also work with states. We work with utilities. We have audits. We have tabletop exercises. It is, I believe, the #1 priority for us to secure the cyber and physical security of our grid.
The thing that I didn't hear when you listed all those things, I'm all for standards, but President Reagan said trust but verify. And I want to know what's being done for verification. I remember having a hearing several years ago with NERC, and I said, do you pen test or red team your utilities? And the answer was no. And I was shocked at that. Has that changed? Do you know, are the utilities hiring hackers for hire to demonstrate whether or not they're secure? Because you can meet all the standards, and there's nothing like a skull and crossbones coming up on the CEO's desktop to remind him or her that they're not actually secure. Ms. Clements, do you think is there pen testing going on and red teaming?
My understanding is that, yes, there are various types of that happening, both via, commission staff support, with FERC staff support, as well as outside of that. I think I'm encouraged by the progress that government agencies have been working together, as well as working with private industry, related to chasing after this evolving threat. I think our standards are good foundational safeguards.
And I don't want to sound like I'm picking on the utilities, because actually I think they may be among the most secure of our critical infrastructure compared with water systems, for example, natural gas pipelines, those other areas. But that doesn't mean we don't have to be extremely diligent because of the magnitude of this threat. Thank you all very much. Thanks for the work that you're doing. Work on those queues at the RTOs, will you? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Chairman Phillips, let me just start with you. Let me start in my home state, Missouri, in St. Louis. The Spire pipeline in St. Louis, as you probably know, has had a long and somewhat unhappy saga until recently. Finally, in December of this past year, the commission gave the pipeline a certificate to operate. I'm asking you about it because, as I hope you know, residents of the St. Louis area have been repeatedly told that their gas bills would rise in a very significant way if the pipeline was not able to operate. Can you give me some assurance that the Spire pipeline in St. Louis will continue to be authorized for the foreseeable future?
Senator, as you know, we handle pipeline certifications on a case-by-case basis. We have a public interest obligation and determination to be made. We take them as they come. My understanding is that I will double-check to make sure with my staff to see what the status is of Spire in particular, but that is the way we approach pipelines, and I support that case-by-case approach.
Okay, good. Well, if you could get back to me, that would be helpful. I want to make sure that this pipeline, which is now FERC approved, continues to operate and that we don't see major disruptions in service for the residents of the St. Louis region. Let me ask you about rural co-ops. My state is a majority rural state. Our rural electric co-ops are a hugely important part of our energy grid in the state of Missouri. They have been facing major supply chain issues, in particular, the purchasing of new transformers. Tell me what you're doing to help keep prices down for rural electric co-ops.
Again, we have a number of reforms that we're moving forward right now. A huge part, and I think affordability is addressed in some of our reforms right now, and it will benefit the country. The more resources that we can bring on, I believe we can help in the long term lower prices for consumers.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that we keep the price of electricity affordable, and again, especially in our rural areas in the state, especially working with rural electric co-ops. That's a huge priority. I look forward to working with you on that. Let me turn to Commissioner Clements. Let me ask you, some emails disclosed last year via a FOIA request showed that you briefed a funders-only session at a left-leaning grant-making foundation called the Energy Foundation about FERC 2022 priorities. Who were the donors who attended that session?
There was not fundraising in the meeting you asked about. It was a convening of foundation staff from across the country, and I was having a very kind of straightforward, above-the-board conversation about 2022 priorities. Subject to my ethics agreement and any ex parte restrictions, I have an open-door policy, so I meet with all kinds of stakeholders. I've actually never said no to a meeting between either my staff taking it or myself.
Wait a minute. You said it was staff. The FOIA information says it was advertised as a funders-only session. Donors.
I'm not sure. It wasn't an advertised thing. There are foundations that work together.
It was briefed as a funders-only session, meaning that there were donors there. So who were the donors?
I think it's important to understand that what my role to do is engage with these stakeholders. When I was invited to present to a group of foundation staff, just like when I'm invited to present to the board of...
I don't understand what you keep using the word staff. The information says that there were funders present. There were donors. I want to know who the donors are. Who were the donors? You give me a list?
I'd be happy to. I
Good.
don't remember specifically, but I'd be happy to.
Good. Was there money raised at the event that you spoke at?
No.
What were the FERC 2022 priorities that you spoke with this donor group about?
I gave my standard speech that I give when I speak to any convening of stakeholders who participate in the sector.
You use stakeholders now several times. Does that include industry donors? Is that a definition of stakeholder now? Our major donors?
Yeah.
Do you think it's appropriate that you would be giving closed-door briefings to donors?
No, and I didn't do that, sir.
What do you mean you didn't do it? That this is, the information says that it was a funders event. It was a funders only session
I'm
at
not-
a foundation that raises money from donors.
I provide my stump speech on my own FERC priorities to many different kinds of groups.
Donors?
Many convening. Some of them might be donors in any capacity. Certainly,
Did any of those donors who were present that day have a financial interest in the energy industry?
almost everyone I speak to has a financial interest in the energy industry.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this is a normal practice of yours to speak to groups that have financial interests in your industry?
So when I go and I talk to the board of EPSA or the EEI CEOs or the interstate pipeline member companies, all of whom I have spent time with, the idea is that subject to ethical responsibilities and also my ex parte restrictions, I engage with them. I tell them my priorities. I get their
Do you think it's appropriate, my time is running out here, do you think it's appropriate to speak to advocacy groups at a donors-only session? Do you think that that's appropriate?
I think it is appropriate to speak with foundations who are interested in the energy.
To their
space.
donor sessions? Wow. Wow. I have to say, I think that that's pretty problematic. I would like a list of the donors. I'd like to know who was there. I'm concerned about this, what you've now described as a pattern and practice of speaking to donor groups that have financial interests in the industry you are regulating. I think that's a big problem. If that's not currently foreclosed by law, we ought to foreclose it, Mr. Chairman. But you said that you do this on a regular basis. We'll probably follow up. I think I'm probably going to need to see a list of all the groups you've spoken to. I'm going to want to know the donors that you've spoken to. I am extremely, extremely disturbed by what you have just told me. And at a time when we have major ethics issues, we've got members of Congress buying and selling stock based on information that only they are privy to. We've got members of the executive branch who are buying and selling stock in industries that they regulate. And now we've got you speaking to donors in industries that you regulate.
Senator, thank you.
That's a problem.
Thank you.
That's a problem, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Other than Ms. Clements, does anybody else speak to groups that you regulate? I'm curious. Any of the other commissioners? Mr. Phillips?
We speak to regulated groups, yes.
Mr. Danley?
Yes.
Mr. Christie?
Yes.
Thank you. So let me move on to Senator Cantwell, and I appreciate her bringing this up, and I appreciate all of you agreeing to support the Energy Consumer Protection Act, because I do think it is important to provide FERC with additional authority to go after traders that repeatedly manipulate electricity and natural gas markets. So thank you. And I invite my colleagues to join me on that on that legislation. Mr. Phillips and Commissioner Clements, let me talk to you a little bit about the extreme weather that we're seeing in the West. I know both of you have written testimony today referenced the unprecedented challenges that our nation's electric system is facing from extreme weather. This has also been underscored by multiple North American Electricity Reliability Corporation assessments over the years, which have pointed to the stress, really, that electric power systems in Western states are under due to wildfires, persistent drought, and heat waves. Chair Phillips, you referenced the February approval of a series of winter preparedness measures filed by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And Commissioner Clements, you touched on recent workshops and conferences to better coordinate and prepare for extreme weather. Chairman Phillips, can you expand on these efforts that FERC is taking to develop a more hardened, resilient grid, particularly as we see this extreme weather happening in the West?
Absolutely, Senator. After the winter storm Elliott that happened in December, FERC requested that NERC do an inquiry into the impacts of the storm and recommendations, provide additional recommendations that we can implement. That inquiry is ongoing. We expect it this summer. It involves an even greater amount of operators than Winter Storm Uri. So it's taken a bit of a time for us to get that, but we look forward to receiving those recommendations. In addition to to talk a little bit more about the reliability standards and the measures that we approved recently in February. I mean, this requires our grid operators, our generators, to actually have a plan. It addresses things like freezing preparedness. These are the types of things that were in play for Winter Storm Uri and other extreme weather. But to be clear, we've seen what used to be 1 in 10 years, 1 in 100 year events that seem to be happening almost every other year. We have to be able to plan our system in a way that is prepared to keep the lights on in these extreme events.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know I don't have much time. Let me jump to this. I understand, and first of all, let me just thank Commissioners Clements and Christie. I understand you were visiting my state, Northern Nevada, last month to meet with some of our state regulators and stakeholders and discuss the Western energy dynamics. Thank you so much. As you all know, there's been significant activity around the wholesale power markets throughout the West in recent years. In fact, Nevada has enacted legislation during the 2021 legislative session that required every transmission provider in the state to explore joining a regional transmission organization by 2030. I'm going to ask you both to comment because I know, I'm curious, Mr. Christie, your comments, concerns about RTOs as well. But Ms. Clements, let me start with you. Can you elaborate on this dating process, as you termed it last month, and speak to some of the Western circumstances that were discussed?
Thank you, Senator. I've been really pleased to see the developments in the West over the last 5 years. State regulators across the region, as well as state legislatures across the region, have identified how do we protect customers and reliability on a forward-looking basis. And so they have been thinking deliberately and carefully about developing markets. They've taken some steps. They've joined balancing markets. They're considering joining day-ahead markets. They haven't gotten all the way to a full-blown RTO, but they're exploring the opportunity. The dating is there are several, at least 2 options, maybe a third for utilities, for RTO options for utilities to join. So they have a choice, and they're kind of in a dating process right now. I think the important thing to say about RTOs is while they're not perfect, the Commission has historically encouraged their formation or encouraged utilities to join them because they have, time and time again, saved customers, improved resilience, and improved reliability. Now, that said, the only way that they stay successful in that endeavor is for the market rules that they operate to evolve as circumstances in the world, like the changing resource mix, like the impact of extreme weather, evolve. And so there's a real opportunity, and one of the nice things about the utilities and the regulators in the West is that they get to learn from all the lessons of the existing RTOs and try and bring forward best practices towards any action that they might decide to take.
Thank you. And I know my time is out, but Mr. Christie, at some point in time, I would love to get your thoughts as well, based on that conversation. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Senator Daines.
Chair Manchin, Ranking Member Brasso, thank you. As the Senate continues to work on permitting reform, I think it's really important that hydropower is part of that conversation. I think in Montana, hydropower accounts for 40% of our state's electricity generation. It's a critical source for on-demand and black start energy for the nation. Hydropower is cheap, it's clean, it's reliable. It's energy for millions of Americans. We must continue to expand hydropower capacity across the entire nation. But I never thought I'd live to see the day where there'd be calls to breach hydropower dams, including individuals in the Biden administration. Rather than talking about breaching hydropower dams, we should be talking about how do we increase hydropower generation. It's one of the great renewable, zero-carbon sources of energy by expediting the licensing processes, not going backwards and breaching dams. Over the last year, I've been working on a comprehensive, bipartisan hydropower licensing reform package that I hope to introduce in the coming days. The bill is supported by a very diverse group of stakeholders, the left, the center, the right, including 2 former FERC commissioners and 2 former FERC chairmen. It's going to expedite licensing and relicensing, expand tribal engagement, streamline the permitting process, and promote the development of hydropower throughout the United States. And by increasing tribal engagement and expediting the permitting process for hydropower projects, including low-impact projects like pumped storage and closed loop, I think it's something that every member of this committee should get behind. Question for Chairman Phillips and Commissioner Christie. Do you think it's important for FERC to prioritize and expand hydropower licensing and relicensing? Chairman Phillips, start with you.
Thank you, Senator. I do believe that hydropower is critical. It is very essential. It's clean, as you mentioned. It's renewable. I believe it can help us with reliability. We've taken on reforms in recent years to speed up our process regarding hydro licensing and relicensing. If you talk about expanding, I think you're talking about pump storage is one element to that. We actually have expedited process for pump storage that's still being implemented. We look forward to working with you. And I met with sponsors recently with the legislation that you mentioned, the Uncommon Dialogue Group. I applaud the efforts that have been made, especially to bring tribal communities to the table. These are factions that you mentioned that have been, fighting each other for a very long time.
Right. Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner Christie.
Senator, I think hydro is very important. FERC's strong suit is rate regulation. We're an economic regulator. But with hydro and these dams, the law gives us many more responsibilities than rate regulation. If it's up to me, I would take away our authority other than in the rate regulation area. We shouldn't be the Parks and Rec Department for a dam, but we are because we're told in the statute you have to consider, for example, recreation opportunities. We also have to do all the NEPA and Endangered Species Act, all those analyses. So the reason why these relicensing takes so many years is because we have so many different interests that we have to weigh, and the statute says equally. I don't want to be the Parks and Rec for a dam. I would just like to be the rate regulator for a dam. And I think that would expedite a lot of these relicensing if those other duties were put in a more appropriate agency, which could be a state agency.
Great. Thanks for the comment. Speaking of tribal consultation, thousands of Montanans in Indian country rely on electricity generated from hydropower. It's important that our tribal members, particularly in the rural and underserved areas, have their voices heard and play an active role during FERC's decision-making process. Chairman Phillips, do you agree that we should incorporate tribal consultation early and often during the licensing process for hydroelectric projects in Indian country?
Yes, I take our obligation very serious regarding tribal consultation. I have participated personally with government-to-government consultation, both as chairman and as commissioner.
Chairman, thank you. Last Congress, I was grateful to see my bill to expedite the process for powering non-powered Army Corps dams be signed into law. Non-powered dams have immense potential to provide abundant, clean, and reliable energy at a very low cost. Retrofitting non-powered dams to produce hydroelectricity is a common-sense approach that would greatly expand renewable energy supply and lower energy costs. Commissioner Danley, do you agree that powering non-powered dams, where it's both safe and economical, is an important way to increase hydropower development and capacity?
Absolutely. There are huge numbers of, vast quantities of impoundments that could easily be used to produce electricity.
Thank you. For Chairman Manchin and Chairman Barrasso, I do hope we could work together to get my hydropower licensing bill in any permitting package moving forward.
We'll work on that. With everything else.
Right.
Senator Hickenlooper.
All right.
First, thank you all for being here, and maybe I will come back to Senator Cortez Masto's question and let Mark Christie answer that in the framework of a larger question. It does circle back to that dating process of local utilities. There's some question about too much local transmission without enough oversight. And I wanted just to give you a few quotes of recent meeting with you had with state regulators. Daniel's got some quotes up there. Commissioner Dutrell from Pennsylvania said, we're seeing more and more local projects coming before us instead of the more significant projects. Commissioner French of Kansas said they, quote, need help examining the pace of investment and whether transmission owners are making the most optimal investments, end quote. To put numbers to it, and we'll put another chart up here. It's my day for charts. From Colorado-based Rocky Mountain Institute, this chart shows the stunning rise in local transmission in our nation's largest electricity market, PJM, before and after 2013, the year PJM updated its transmission planning. All three pairs of bars show different types of local transmission as a percentage of total spending on transmission. Since 2013, you can see we've been building much more local transmission across the board. Every bit of this ends up on the ratepayers' bills at a time when everyone's hurting from the commodity prices and other increases. All the while, the development of large-scale transmission projects that I think in many cases create the greatest efficiencies on the grid, they've stalled. So within that, you can talk a little bit about.
Senator, I think one of the problems with transmission spend that we have today is, as you mentioned, it's in the RTOs in particular, 80-some% of the spend is on what are called local projects, and they're coming out of one load-serving entity. And that's not automatically a good thing or a bad thing. But in terms of numbers, here's what happens, though. So because of you can go back many years in FERC history, but they get to come to FERC for what's called formula rate recovery. And formula rate recovery contrasts to state rate recovery. I was a state regulator for many years. Formula rate recovery is almost a plug-and-play type of process. It's very hard to challenge that. So what happens is the RTOs are really not reviewing or vetting closely the local projects, but yet they're going into a regional plan, which means they're going to be cost allocated across the RTO. Right. And then they come to FERC for cost recovery, and our formula rate mechanism is sort of an automatic, it's not much, it's very hard to challenge transmission spend there. And what's happened too is in the RTOs, several states, I no doubt at the behest of lobbyists, who didn't want state regulators to take a close look, have lobbied for laws that have stripped state regulators of the authority to vet these local projects. And so what you've got is basically a situation where it's tremendously financially rewarding to build local projects because the RTOs aren't looking at them that closely. The state regulators in many states have been stripped of authority to look at them, and then they get to come to FERC and get formula rate recovery.
And so, and I'll go down the list, whether any of you, this relative ease of self-approving local transmission is coming at the expense of the larger projects. Why don't you each just take a 20 seconds or 30 seconds at that?
Thanks, Senator. I agree with most of Commissioner Christie's framing of the issue, and I've been pleased that we've been able to work together on some mechanisms that get at this issue, and I hope we can finalize some process on that front.
Great. Commissioner Danley?
So Commissioner Christie is correct, Senator, that formula rate treatment does have something to do with it. There's something else, though, which is that the more FERC attempts to establish mechanisms by which people are to plan transmission, the more strange incentives are created. And so, in part, it's an effort to get around and have easier treatment of transmission projects than our processes that we created for the purpose of improving competition, right, just like the markets. We created these processes, they create perverse incentives, and it's easier to do processes for local transmission than the big projects you're talking about. So the more FERC you get, the less transmission you get in some cases.
Right, which is regrettable. Mr. Chair?
Senator, this comes down to cost for me, and I think the cure to it is more transparency in the local process. This is exactly why we're taking this up in our regional transmission planning open.
Great, I appreciate that. And I've got 25 seconds, so I'll plan a question which I'm not, it's just, it would take too long. I have another regional question. I will put that in the written record. I'm out of time. By the time I got halfway through the question, I'd already be well over it. So I'll yield back to the chair. Thank you all for being here. Really, this is very useful this morning.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I particularly enjoy sitting here in an Energy Committee room with the FERC commissioners in front of us and having it be relatively calm. No protesters, no security at the door. My times have changed. Senator Daines and I were just remarking that when both of us came here to the Senate, hydro was not considered a renewable resource. So I want to...
Moonshine does wonders for him.
No comment, Mr. Chairman. Hydropower, I want to stick with the same theme that Senator Daines hit on, because for us in the state of Alaska, hydropower is about 20% of our state's electricity on average every year. That's a pretty low amount, quite honestly, given the extraordinary hydropower reserves that we have, particularly in our southeastern part of the state. So many of our communities rely on small hydro or run-of-river projects, and this is what is allowing them to get off of diesel power generation. But unfortunately, for so many of them, it's just so expensive. It's ridiculously expensive to go through the FERC process, to go through the legal battles. And so what happens is these communities are stuck. They're stuck with diesel-generated power. And if that isn't an environmental justice in and of itself, I don't know what is. So this is a question for you. I'm not talking about Big Bonneville or Hoover. I'm talking about our small hydro facilities, our small run-of-river, don't impact your fisheries. What more can we do? We've got to be doing a better job to ensure that these small and rural communities can have access to hydropower without it being cost prohibitive. There was a time way back when we had actually advanced provisions that could allow these smaller hydro projects to avoid the FERC process. You know, that may be something that we need to be looking at, but what do you got? Because there's got to be a better answer than the status quo.
Thank you, Senator.
Commissioner Phillips.
We talked about this recently when I had a chance to speak with you. I agree with you, and I understand the frustration, especially when you talk about some of these small operations, as you mentioned, mom and pop type operations dealing with this vast process. There are 3 different licensing processes that FERC has, and they're different from original to traditional to sort of like a hybrid. We also have we have a pilot project where we are, considering other ways that we can process applications. But I absolutely agree. We have to do more to make this process more streamlined. I'm focused on it. I have our entire Office of Projects team working on it.
So let me ask a question directly to that, because you had mentioned, I think in answer to Senator Daines, that you were working to speed the processing. But one of the things that is concerning to me is apparently what we're seeing is that now there are numerous requests coming from FERC staff for additional information related to FERC licensing amendment applications. So in order to get the FERC approval of some pretty standard operation and maintenance activities, this is like in-kind replacement of equipment at the end of its useful life. So you've got a situation where staff is asking for additional information that can theoretically delay the project and further add to the cost of the project. So again, it gets back to we can't even start. So let me give you some specifics here. What we understand is FERC's standard hydropower license conditions, these L forms, have long required prior FERC approval only when there's an activity that is, quote, a substantial change to the project, works, and plans. So now what we're seeing is that FERC is not necessarily following those license conditions. They're requiring approval for activities that are clearly not, quote, substantial. Again, what that does is it allows or it requires, it demands a longer period to process and approve these license amendment applications. So if this is something that you're looking at, good. If you're not looking at it, I would just ask you to commit to going back to the Federal Power Act and FERC's standard licensing requirements and what they actually require, that the licensees are to maintain their projects in adequate operating condition, that the FERC require approval through license amendment only for substantial changes to the license. Because what we're hearing is that there's now an add-on, and that add-on is adding time, and that add-on is adding cost and taking it to a place where you and I are in agreement. We need to be speeding up a process, we need to be streamlining a process, and we need to be making it more affordable.
I commit to looking at this and working with your office to provide you the information you request, Senator.
Good. I look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Phillips and the other members, thank you for being here today. Chairman Phillips, in your testimony, you mentioned that reliability is job number 1. And the bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed includes $3 billion to expand smart technology that allows for the efficient use of existing transmission lines. It enables demand response. It improves grid reliability. Demand response technology can include smart thermostats or appliances that can save consumers money and also stabilize the electrical grid during times of peak energy demand. And additionally, the bipartisan infrastructure law contains a provision that I authored that directs the department to promote
the installation of demand response technology in all federal buildings. And we've seen this technology work pretty well, especially in Arizona. 2020 was a regional heat wave that spanned 12 western states. It forced California to implement some rolling brownouts. And Arizona was only able to keep the lights on and the air conditionings running thanks to this demand response program. The utility was able to turn off the air conditioning in tens of thousands of homes. And it kept the grid from crashing. And this also benefited customers. I mean, in exchange for this voluntary participation in this program, they got a rebate or a discount. And Arizona utilities were then able to sell some excess energy to California at the same time. So what is the status of the implementation of the demand response provisions that were put into the bipartisan infrastructure law for federal buildings?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I want to applaud the work, your office and this committee for the Infrastructure Act. I believe that demand response, I agree with you, is a critically important tool, especially when we have reliability events on the grid. As you mentioned, California has recently used it. Many places in the West have used it. FERC has implemented Order Number 2222, which opens the market to distributed energy resources, including demand response. There's also a situation with opt-outs that it's not included in 2222, but in another order, 741, I believe, states have the option to opt out. We have a proceeding that's ongoing right now to address that opt-out situation.
They would be able to opt out from federal buildings?
No, sir. I'm speaking more general. Speaking more general.
Beyond what we have today, then, so we have this as voluntary in, I think, upwards of about 30,000 homes in Arizona, and that's voluntary, and people get a credit or a rebate. And then when we add it in federal buildings, that provides a bigger response that we can implement in times when we need it. What do you think we should be doing beyond that with this technology?
I think first of all, to take a step back, many of the distributed energy resources that we talked about, they're behind the meter resources. Our state, regulators, they have a significant role as part of their jurisdiction. I agree with you. The cheapest megawatt is the one you don't use. And so this is something that I continue to support. I will open to discussions, and I look forward to working with your office to see what more we can do.
All right, and I'm going to quote you on that. The cheapest megawatt is the one we do not use.
That's right.
I'm going to hold on to that.
Thank you, Senator.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Senator Hoeven.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. According to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, MISO faces a 1,300 megawatt capacity shortfall beginning this summer. And this trend is continuing to grow as older baseload requirements outpace new replacement generation, more variable generation. Both Commissioners Christie and Danley noted this critical problem in their written statements. So let's start with you, Commissioner Christie. Are there specific policies accelerating the retirement of coal and gas dispatchable resources, and what should be done to reverse this trend?
Well, the RTO markets, which I've said before, are not true markets, they're administrative constructs. The rate designs are not working because particularly in the capacity markets, when resources are heavily subsidized, they get to bid in at zero or close to zero. And the way these markets work with the pricing mechanisms is they have a thing called a single clearing price mechanism. And they start with the lowest bid. So if you get to bid in at zero, you're automatically going to clear. And then they work up to the last unit. And the last unit's usually a gas combustion turbine or very expensive. And then everybody else gets the top price. So the problem is the financial incentives are driving out of these markets capital intensive or units that have high marginal costs like coal and gas because they have to buy fuel, obviously, so their marginal costs are higher. So it's really a rate design issue in the RTOs. Now, in the non-RTOs, what's happening is that state IRPs, driven by state policies, are moving towards eliminating, particularly coal, in many states and replacing with renewable. And again, the problem is, as I've said, is not the addition of wind and solar. The problem is the subtraction of dispatchable resources. And it's just not adding up. Now, at least in a state IRP, you can correct. And I would give one example. 3 years ago in Virginia, our largest utility, when I was on the Virginia Commission, filed an IRP, and it had a number of retirements, early retirements, that Dominion was proposing. Those were factored into PJM's loss of 40 gigawatts that I mentioned at the beginning of this proceeding. Well, Dominion filed a new IRP just this week, and they've sort of corrected that one from 3 years ago, and they're going to keep units on board longer. So it's an example how in an IRP structure, you can change the resource mix and respond to needs. In these markets, there's nothing planned. These markets simply reward or don't reward, and so the problem in these markets is the units that we need to stay in operation are not being sufficiently rewarded to keep them in business, and they're giving up and shutting down.
And we've seen real problems because of that, with blackouts and brownouts and not having power when you've had polar vortexes in various parts of the country, have we not?
Yeah, I mean, PJM in the Winter Storm Elliott came very, very close to rotating outages. Now, one of the big problems was a lot of gas didn't show up. And the reason a lot of gas didn't show up is because they didn't have firm supply. And they didn't have firm supply because they didn't have enough transportation, and also the economics just don't work. There's been a lot of complaints from a lot of independent gas generators in PJM, for example, about weatherization standards. They say they don't have the money to make the weatherization standards. Well, units that are in rate base have the money to make the weatherization standards. Units that are IPPs and only depend upon the markets, particularly the energy markets. The energy markets simply do not provide enough revenue for capital-intensive units. That's why they came up with the capacity market. And the bottom line is they're just not working to keep enough resources available to keep the lights on. In an IRP situation, you can adjust the same way because you can make adjustments and make sure your portfolio is balanced. And that's what we need here, are balanced portfolios of all these different types of resources, from dispatchable to renewable, in a way that keeps the lights on at the lowest possible cost.
Yeah, and this is at a time when we are aggressively working in states like mine and certainly like the chairman's to capture CO2 and sequester it, which of course adds some cost as well. That, again, increases your capital cost, but it captures CO2 at the same time. But if you wipe out all those plants before we even get to that point, you lose all that base load power for the system. I was going to go to Commissioner Danley next, but since the chairman's nodding his head, I've got to jump to you and ask for your response.
Senator, I have to say I am extremely concerned when it comes to the pace of retirements that we're seeing of generators that are needed for reliability on our system. NERC and other grid operators have warned about this, as I mentioned earlier. This is something that we have to keep a careful eye on. We have to work with the states. They have plenary authority over resource adequacy, but there's an opportunity. We're resource neutral, but we're not reliability neutral. And so I'm focused on this issue.
Thank you, Chairman. Committee Chairman, I beg indulgence for one more question for Mr. Danley. Would that be
Absolutely.
Would that be agreeable with you?
Can't wait to hear it.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Neither can I.
Commissioner Danley, I'd like you to weigh in on this issue, too, as you have commented on it, and I appreciate your comments here.
So, yes, I do. Thank you, Senator. So the problem is the subsidies that are being driven by the federal government and states in the markets, and it is our abject failure as an institution, FERC, to exercise our rate-making powers to protect those markets from the influence of those subsidies. That is the reason why these retirements are happening prematurely, and the results, I fear, are going to be catastrophic down the road. The resource adequacy that typically resides with the states in an ordinary vertically integrated utility set before the markets were established, they looked through IRP processes to make sure that everything was going to be able, all the requirements for load would be met by sufficient generation, and that simply doesn't happen in markets. We rely upon market forces to accomplish that objective, and when we undermine the markets and we send warped and distorted price signals, it is impossible for that sole means of procurement to actually achieve the objective. It will ultimately fail, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. I have one follow-up, and it's pretty simple. In today's world, and what you all have talked about, the energy and the grid system and all that, do any of you believe that it's possible to eliminate coal today or in the near future and be able to maintain a reliable or somewhat reliable system? Is coal intricately irreplaceable at this point in time. Chairman Phillips?
Senator, we've talked about this before. I believe in an all-of-the-above approach. Whatever resources are needed to keep our grid reliable, we have to make sure that they are
I think what I'm asking is basically we know that the only dispatchable we have. I've been told forever that you only have 2 base loads. That's coal and nuclear.
Coal is
Everything else can be interrupted, and even coal if it gets bad enough. But usually, the coal power, if it's 60 days, it'll run 60 days. If the nuke's fueled, it'll run. Gas will run if you can get gas to it, but you have more chances of gas being interrupted. So the only 2 you really have for all of our period of time that I've grown up in has been those 2.
Yes, sir. You're
So
right.
if you pulled it off right now, would it give you the certainty that the system would give you the reliability needed?
It would not.
Okay. Senator, or Commissioner?
Thank you. No, as things stand, coal is required. It makes up, I don't know, just under a quarter of all the installed capacity in America. And if it were, it would be impossible, given the locations and the realities of the electric system, to replace it.
Commissioner Clements?
Right now, today, no.
Coal is more dependable than gas, and yes, we need to keep coal generation available for the foreseeable future.
Coming from the coal fields and been born and raised in the coal fields, I've seen all the sacrifices been made to provide the energy the country is needed, and also during war efforts and everything else. There's a transition going on, and everyone understands the transition. The only thing I'm trying to make a point is that the expediency of which this administration and other administrations have tried to move the market or move their source of energy before we had anything to replace it with. And all you have to do is go talk to the Europeans. They'll tell you, please don't do what we did. And I've spoken to all of them. And with that being said, we're using coal now, and I know in my state, I think every plant has been scrubbed. It's got low NOx boilers. It's got bag houses. Now, for the first time, we're putting an actual cost to basically helping the sequestering. So it should be able to remove most of the concerns we've had from the environment while we still have a stable source. So I'm thankful for that. Do you have another, by any chance, another question? Let me just say this. I appreciate it. It's been quite informing. You all done a great job. The information you've given us and the advancements you all made in the last year working together as a team, I think is admirable. And I thank you for that. Let me make sure. What do we have here? He's running back for what? Oh, is he here? Yep. Okay, hurry up, Josh. Senator Hawley has one follow-up question.
There we go. Senator Cortez Masto asked, on this ethics issue, can we just go down the line? I know what the answer is as it respects Ms. Clements, but for the rest of you, Chairman Phillips, do you speak to industry groups, to donor meetings behind closed doors of donors who may have financial interest in your industry?
No,
yes
sir.
Or no? Next.
No.
Go ahead.
I didn't speak at a donors meeting. There was no donating happening, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can talk to my agency ethics official who saw no problem and has not seen any problem with any of the meetings I've taken during my term.
But it was a funder. It was a meeting of funders, donors. You're saying that there were no donations solicited, right?
These are policy-focused foundations who participate in the sector by making grants, just like PE shops make investments, just like CEO utilities make investments. There was no inappropriate conversation that took place.
If I can interrupt just 1 second, make sure I understand. I think what the senator is trying to get to. Did any of you know you're going to a donor-sponsored event? There's going to be donors. My goodness, special interests is everywhere. You know, everybody's. But going and speaking in generalities of what you do, what your thoughts are, and what you all probably have all been in those, and you didn't go and solicit saying, well, I'm going to a donor to give them a little bit of red meat, what they want, so they'll give more. Is that correct? Is that where you're going, Senator?
Well, I'm disturbed by the idea that anybody, and this is why I was worried when Senator Cortez Masto asked the question, everybody answered yes. I just want to be sure that we're not going to events that are funders-only events. Funder means donor, that are donor events.
You mean advertise as one?
Correct, yes,
Okay.
sir.
Does any of them advertise as donor events?
Yes, sir, as this one was. What about you, sir? Do you speak?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Yeah, I would hope not, and we'll have a lot of questions for the record on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify that.
No
'cause
problem, I get you.
I'm alarmed by it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let me just say to all of you again, I appreciate so much you all coming and being frank and forthright and doing the job you're doing. We got a lot of work to do, got heavy lifting to do, and the country needs to keep the lights on. So thank you for that, and any of our members will have until tomorrow afternoon to submit any other questions they might not have, and with that, meeting's adjourned.